Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to do what I think is a relatively simple scene in charcoal with some rolling hills and trees. Let's start. So the first thing I got to take care of is the composition. I got to work out the shape of the terrain, and once I know roughly what it's going to look like, it's easier for me to work on the smaller elements. So let's start with that first. The size of the paper is around 9 times 12 inches, by the way. I'm going to work mostly with charcoal, and I'm going to work with this piece of willow charcoal. I always like to use several forms of charcoal. I work in charcoal powder, willow charcoal and charcoal pencils. So I started out with this piece of willow charcoal, which is a soft natural charcoal, to try to cover this upper portion of the scene with a little bit of value. I need it to be a bit lighter, just to have enough value so that the clouds would stand out. So now, as you can see, I'm blending that with a piece of paper towel with gentle circular motions. But I felt that this was maybe not dark enough. I need just a little bit more value, so I decided to put down a bit of charcoal powder. This is going to be a bit quicker, but also a bit smoother, and it's going to give me a little bit more value in the background. The reason why this value is important is because if we don't have that, the clouds won't stand out. And I need the clouds to stand out because they're going to be mostly white. I'm adding a little bit more at the top as needed. But once I have that in place, once that is blended in nicely, I can start working on the clouds. For the clouds, I'm going to use one of my erasers. This time I'm using a kneaded eraser. And just like I like to use different forms of charcoal, I like to use different types of erasers as well. A kneaded eraser allows me to lift up a little bit of this charcoal dust, create areas of lighter value, and as I'm dabbing and dragging this kneaded eraser, I can produce the types of shapes that I want. I can make them a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. I can create slightly cleaner edges or slightly more dispersed, wispy shapes. And that's why this tool is so convenient for drawing clouds. Later I'm going to use a pencil eraser as well, but for now I'm using this just to get some random natural looking shapes for the clouds. I'm going to blend that a little bit with a paper towel to soften it, and after that I'm going to start putting in some trees and some foliage. So here in the upper right corner of the scene we're going to have some branches and leaves popping into the scene from the left, and I'm drawing these with the same piece of willow charcoal that I started out with. Willow charcoal is a great drawing tool for foliage because it allows you to create these large random shapes that kind of look like leaves or clusters of leaves, and you can do it with very little effort. The trick, I think, is to vary the shapes and the direction of those tiny marks that you're making, because if you make them all the same, they won't really look like foliage, or they will look too uniform. They will look unnatural. So if you want to make them look more organic, more random, more realistic, just try to vary the size, the shape, the direction in which you're pulling those strokes, and then you'll come up with all kinds of tiny shapes that look like foliage. You want to group them together a little bit, and you want to have some of them a little bit kind of detached from the rest of the cluster, because leaves are connected to the branches with tiny twigs, and sometimes you can't even see those twigs at the distance. That's why these tiny shapes which are separated from the rest of the cluster look so realistic. Now, willow charcoal is a little bit lighter than compressed charcoal in your charcoal pencils, so I'm going to switch to a charcoal pencil now. And the reason why I'm using this here is because I want to produce some areas of darker value. These are shadow areas because the foliage, the canopy of the tree is not going to be of the same color, it's not going to be of the same value. Some parts of that foliage, some parts of that canopy are simply getting more light than the others. And the ones which are further away from the light source, more tucked deeper into the canopy, those are going to appear darker. Those which are a little bit closer to the surface, which are popping out or protruding out of the rest of that foliage, those are going to appear lighter. Now the reason why I'm softening them with a tortillon now is because the charcoal pencil produces a little bit more of that tiny texture that doesn't really look like the foliage that I'm trying to produce. So I had to blend that in a little bit. Now I'm going to draw a little bit more, or shade a little bit more with this piece of willow charcoal, but I'm also going to eliminate this lower clusters of leaves here on the left because it doesn't really fit into my composition. So I'm just going to work over it. So now I have the sky, I have some clouds, I have the contrast between the sky and the clouds, and I have a really nice contrast and tension between the background or the sky and those branches and leaves which are popping into the scene from the left. Very nice contrast and tension. And now I'm going to shade these rolling hills. First I'm giving them a little bit of value using that piece of willow charcoal, doing some blending, and then adding a little bit more as needed. At the top of one of those hills I'm going to draw a bunch of trees and bushes, kind of looming over the edge of that hill. And these are quite a bit further away, so they're going to be smaller, but also their shapes and their texture is going to have to be different, as well as the amount of detail, because the stuff that is further in the distance is going to be less defined, it's going to appear less detailed, and maybe there's also going to be less contrast because it's further away. I want to try to imitate the atmospheric effect where the stuff gets a little bit more bluish, a little bit blurrier as you look further in the distance. So there's going to be less contrast and less texture on these objects which are further back on that hill. There's still going to be a little bit of contrast because I want to define at least some of the smaller shapes within those larger shapes, which is why I'm going to add a touch of that charcoal pencil. So once again, the compressed charcoal, which is what charcoal pencils are made of, is a little bit darker than willow charcoal, especially when you blend it. Willow charcoal gets lighter because it doesn't really stick to the surface of the paper. So this way I'm able to add a little bit of value and create some suggestions of lighter and darker shapes. And this is very useful as long as I'm staying consistent with the light source. The light is coming from above, and I feel like in this scene it's coming a little bit more from the left than the right, which is why if you look at all of those tiny canopies on that hill, all of them will be a little bit darker at the bottom and a little bit lighter at the top and on the left. Now I'm doing a bit of refining on these clouds. I decided to go in with a pencil eraser. This is a Koh-i-Noor pencil eraser I'm using here. And I'm using it to define some smaller shapes and maybe to break that larger group or mass of clouds into slightly smaller objects, smaller shapes, so that the clouds themselves would appear a little bit more interesting. That doesn't need to be too much contrast. I'm not going to bother trying to make these clouds super detailed because I have other stuff in the scene. but I just added a little bit more detail to them. So now I'm moving on with the rest of these trees, and I have to add more and more detail to them, but at the same time I always have to go back and blend them in with a tortillon a little bit, because I don't want the texture to be too rough. Because remember, texture, the tiny texture that the pencil produces, that's essentially an illusion of detail. So if you want something to be less detailed, you gotta soften that texture. I'm also adding a little bit of shadow, some suggestions of shadows being cast by those trees on the top of the hill. And now I'm going to start adding some objects which are a little bit closer to the foreground area. I'm moving on to the midground area. Basically, I'm going to draw some trees which are in front of that row of trees in the back. I'm going to draw one here. First I drew the tree trunk to position the tree, and then I started working on the canopy. Now for the canopy to stand out against the trees in the back, I'm going to make the top part of the canopy a little bit lighter. I always have to try to create contrast in value so that I can show where one object ends and the other one begins. I added a little bit of shadow under that tree to integrate it into the rest of the scene. And now I'm adding some variation in value on that slope, because I don't want it to look too simple and too monotonous. So I'm going to add a little bit of variation here and there. And now I'm adding some more trees. This is going to be like a group of trees or a cluster of trees. So I draw a couple of tree trunks, and now I'm going to draw some canopies. I'm going to break this shape into slightly smaller shapes by making some indications of shadow areas, and I'm going to draw another tree here to the right, and maybe some more bushes and stuff in other parts of the scene. But now let's focus on the canopies here, because I'm moving a little bit closer to the foreground area. The canopies of the trees are going to appear a little bit more detailed. So first I blended that initial layer that I put in with the willow charcoal, then I added some darker value with a charcoal pencil, and then I blended that a little bit, leaving a little bit more texture and a little bit more detail than I did on the trees which are further back on that on the top of that hill. So in case you're wondering about the other materials, the charcoal pencil I'm using is a Master's Touch woodless charcoal pencil. I'm also dragging this Kohinoor pencil eraser in order to create some areas of lighter value. So the reason why and now I'm adding a little bit of shadow under these trees. So the reason why these variations in value are important is not just so that you could make the terrain look more complex, but also more realistic, because it's not going to be all smooth. There's going to be some variations in the terrain, it's going to be variations in the type and the length of the grass and things like that. So not all of it is going to appear of the same value, and because of that shape of the terrain of those rolling hills, some parts of those hills are going to be more exposed to the light source, which is why they're going to be lighter. Others are going to be a little bit darker. Here, closer to the foreground, we're going to have a group of bushes, which again I'm going to draw with a piece of willow charcoal. So whenever I have to draw foliage, probably my favorite tool is willow charcoal, especially when I have to draw larger pieces of foliage, larger groups or clusters of leaves. When I'm trying to imitate the appearance of foliage as seen from a larger distance, I can use a charcoal pencil, because a charcoal pencil will produce a very tiny grainy texture. But for something larger, I think charcoal stick works better. The only thing is that once you blend it a little bit, it becomes lighter, but you can always add a little bit of darker value here and there, making some portions of those bushes a little bit darker and making them more three-dimensional in the process, because you need that range of value in order to show the relationship of the object to the light source, and in order to show the shape of that object. So as you can see, I have a group of bushes here, and they are in front of some other bushes there, which is why the top of them stands out against that area of darker value. And at the bottom, they themselves have a shadow area or an area of darker value, because that's the part of those bushes which is further away from the light source. So it's not that complicated once you understand some of the basics. You always have to remember the direction of the light source and how it interacts with your object, and as long as you're aware of that, you should be able to produce a fairly realistic looking scene and fairly realistic looking objects. I'm now, as you can see, moving on to the foreground area and adding some indications of some taller grass and some variations in value and the shape of the terrain there as well. The reason why I'm using such larger strokes and larger shapes here is because obviously all of this is closer to our viewpoint, and whatever is closer to our viewpoint is going to appear larger. So the blades of grass, the clumps or the clusters of grass which are closer to our viewpoint are going to appear much larger and taller than the ones which are further back, which will be barely discernible, barely defined at all. So here I'm making some larger strokes in order to create that suggestion of clumps of grass, and I can refine that with a pencil eraser by adding a few pencil strokes to make it look like there are some lighter blades of grass popping out here and there. There's really no need to overdo it. These variations in lighter and darker value are already enough for the viewer to feel like there is some variation there in terms of the shape of the terrain and the length of the grass and the density of the grass in different places. But a few suggestions, a few details here and there will go a long way. They will help a lot to kind of entertain the eye of the viewer, distract them, and to make them think that like they're looking at something really detailed. So just a few details is usually enough. Sometimes I will go for a slightly more detailed scene, but this time we're going for something slightly simpler, I think. I'm drawing a tree here, a taller, larger tree here on the right. This one is a lot closer to our viewpoint, so it's going to have to be much more defined, and it's going to have more texture and detail. And I'm just drawing the shape of the tree trunk and the branches, trying to come up with a shape that looks nice and realistic. The right side is going to be the shadow side, which is why I'm going to add a little bit more value to it. As you can see now, I'm working mostly with a pencil, with a charcoal pencil, and I'm still going to add some value and some detail with a piece of willow charcoal as well. But I'm going to do a lot of the work with a charcoal pencil now, because I want to produce a texture that looks like a rough surface of a tree, of tree bark. And I can't really draw every single crack and every single detail. I'm not really going to be bothered with that, but just by dragging my pencil and allowing it to produce a little bit of texture on its own will help a lot. I'm going to do some blending on top of that. That's not going to remove all of the texture, so don't worry about that. It's just going to soften it a little bit and add a little bit of value overall. After all, I can always go back in and make the texture look a little bit more rough by adding a little bit more with a charcoal pencil. So the tree needs to stand out against the sky in terms of its value, and the same goes for its foliage. So just like we have the foliage on the left side, Now we're going to draw some here on the right. This canopy is going to be a bit larger and perhaps a bit more detailed. I just got to draw a few more of these branches, and I got to try to make them look realistic, because branches, as they grow out, the direction in which they grow is kind of unpredictable, but also they taper and they're thicker at the base. So that's something that you need to keep in mind in order to make them look realistic. So you can see again how I'm drawing these shapes of leaves and groups of leaves, and there's not much to it. It's not a big deal, but you have to try to keep varying the shapes in terms of the size and the direction. You can see that I don't really know if you can tell, but I keep changing the way I'm pulling these tiny strokes. Sometimes I'm going back and forth, sometimes up and down, and I'm changing the angle and the direction ever so slightly, which is why I'm getting such varied shapes. If you just keep doing the same thing and making the same mark, it won't look that good. It'll still sort of look like foliage, but this way, when you introduce a little bit more variation in there, it looks more realistic. So it takes a little bit of practice, and over time, as you practice, you get a little bit more comfortable with it, because the first time you try to draw foliage and to introduce that variation, you'll be a lot more tense, but as you practice, it gets a lot more relaxing, and you kind of accept the shapes and the things that you initially considered as mistakes, and you just go with them and you turn them into something that is a little bit more to your liking. Anyway, I'm adding some darker shadow areas with a charcoal pencil, just like I did with a canopy on the left, and then softening that with a tortillon to make those shapes look a little bit more realistic and a little bit larger, because the charcoal pencil produces a little bit of a finer texture. So I'm going back over that with a piece of willow charcoal, and then with an eraser to maybe draw some lighter leaves or groups of leaves which are popping out and catching a bit more light from that light source. I'm adding some more darker grass at the base of the tree, a little bit more shadow, because the tree will be casting a bit of shadow under it, so the grass is going to appear darker in that area. And I'm always going to soften that grass a little bit with a brush, because I can't draw every single blade of grass. It's kind of like when you're drawing hair or fur. The way to create that feeling of density and volume is just by using blending tools. For blending, I normally use either brushes or tortillons, and sometimes I even use my finger. But for larger areas which need to be a lighter value, like that sky, I usually use a paper towel. I'm just adding some more detail to these trees in the distance, and making them look a little bit more three-dimensional, adding some details on the tree as well. I made some parts of that top part of the tree trunk a little bit darker, because the branches and the foliage are casting a bit of shadow onto it, so I want a little bit of that variation in value on the tree trunk itself. And now I'm just adding some more detail at the base of the tree, adding some suggestions of roots and some grass around it and things like that. Finally, I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner of the scene, and I also forgot to add some more detail to these bushes here, so I'm just going to finish those, add a little more value and a little bit more texture to them, and then the scene will be done. Once that is done, I will pretty much wrap things up. So I hope you like how the scene turned out. No reference photo this time. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and give me a like. There are also lots of other charcoal videos, so you might want to check those out as well. And for longer videos and more content, you should check out my Patreon. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.